Hey everybody, and welcome to the second week of Kojo 121 Interpersonal Communication. And this week, our goal is to take the observations of what our communication activities were last week and form that into a system understanding of how we communicate with the world. So sometimes you'll hear me interchange the word network with systems. Um, and so networks are just systems of relationships or representations of that. So we'll get into that definition here a little bit. Okay, so what's a system? A system is a set of independent entities that form relationships among themselves to create a sum that's greater than any part. And what that means is that it's a group of relationships that without those relationships, the things within that group could not uh, produce whatever it is they're producing. Okay, and so that whole whatever it is they're producing part is important. We, as the people defining a system, set the boundaries on that, and it can be defined all kinds of ways. Um, we are going to be looking at communication systems, so bounding the system around our communicative practices, those things that you recorded in the last activity. Um, Communication is a complex system. Things happen at different rates and across different spatial boundaries. That makes it complex. You can also have simple systems that's more like the engine in your car or a thermostat. But with complex systems like we're talking about here, there's nested elements within them. It means that we can have a societal level communication system uh, that is made up of each of our individual communication systems inside of that. And then even within ourselves, we can have different subsystems of how we communicate on Facebook versus how we communicate in the coffee shop. Okay, so let's kind of break all that down a little bit. Um, so communication is a system. There's a couple elements or things in that system that we want to be always defining for ourselves. Okay, first is this idea of the transactional model. We're going to get into that in a minute. That is the foundational way that we actually communicate with others. And so it's the mechanism of external understanding. It means that without this idea of the transactional model, or really the process of transactional communication, we cannot communicate with the outside world. Okay, we do that through the channels that we listen to. Listen is in quotes because listen's the ears, but we also see and smell and touch. Um, uh, so the channels that we listen to are important, and then the platforms that we listen through. Okay, we'll define those in a second. Then the frequency of exchange, so how often, how regular exchanges occur, and then how much value we put on each exchange. Um, and then to make that a system, we look at the relationship between all of those elements. So we define our platforms, we identify the frequency, and we set the value. And a lot of that you did in last week's activities. So this time we're going to be putting it together and looking at the relationships between them all. So let's take a minute and define or explain the transactional model and this idea of the base unit. Um, so a transactional model, you'll read about this all over the place. It's got four parts. Okay, the first part is that a communicator sends out a signal. Sometimes that's, talking. Sometimes that's body language. In this particular instant right now, it's me making this video and posting it. Okay, so I send out a signal. You all have to receive it. Okay, and then encode and decode and do all that stuff in the picture. But you have to get the signal. You have to watch this video. Okay, now, right now, or right there at that point where you're watching the video, we kind of typically stop thinking about the communicative process. but it's only halfway done. I have not communicated with you yet. I have only shared information. In order to complete the communication, what has to happen is you have to give me some feedback back, probably in the form of the activity, maybe in the form of a meeting if we haven't met yet today, in the beginning, right? So you have to give me feedback. I have to receive that. And then I have to make internal change based on what I receive from you. If I don't do that, if I completely ignore it, don't pay attention to it, I have not completed any bit of communication with you from my perspective. Okay. The most fundamental part is that I, as the initial sender of information, do not complete my communication until I have gotten something back and made change based on that. That could be a very small change, like, oh, maybe you look a little like maybe we're face to face and you kind of raise your eyebrows, and I'm like, ooh, that means they didn't get it. So I just restate something. It could be a really big change, like, uh, I don't know, somebody says something and I'm like, well, I'm moving, right? It could be big or small, but there has to be change. And I'll just add that this is also the definition of learning. So if we think about what learning is communication. Communication is the mechanism of learning. All right. Uh, so a key thing with this transactional model is that it overlaps among communicators. So when that example I just gave of sending this video out to you, when you reply back to me, when I get some reply or response from you, that is the beginning, step one of your base communication unit. It doesn't end until you get something back from me and then adapt or make change from that, which is, like, ooh, that was a great suggestion. He's totally right. Or that guy, he doesn't know anything. I'm just gonna, now I have to do this to get a good grade in the class, right? Like it doesn't matter what conclusions you come to in that internal change, but if you don't have change, then you have not communicated. Okay, so we overlap this cycle across communicators. We also overlap that cycle across senses. We might be talking face to face and sharing um, both the verbal communication, the words that I'm saying, as well as my body language, as well as the physical environment. Like maybe I'm shivering a little because we're both cold, right? Or I'm cold and you may also be cold, but we're overlapping those sensory inputs um, as we communicate. Uh, and just a side note, when we use different forms of distance communication, from anything from the phone to the telephone, from a book to the telephone to the internet, what we're doing is funneling down how many senses we're engaging in the communication act. So on the phone, you're just using your ears. On a book, you're just using your eyes. On a video, you use your eyes and your ears. Okay. Um, and then lastly, all of this sort of overlap of senses and how we like to communicate, the preferences we have for completing our base units, how fast we like to complete them, things like that, the tools we like to use to do it. Those are all socially, culturally developed and influenced. So your culture that makes the people and the society you're in make a big difference on what your preferences are here. And they're also individual. So that's the idea of those nested systems. There's cultural norms, communication norms, and then individual norms within those cultures. All right. So this is the mechanism for external learning. We do that by collecting information, reflecting on it, and then sharing back out. That's sort of a big picture way of saying receiving information, making change, and then replying. So very related to the base communication unit. Right, we do that through different channels and platforms and the tools we use to access those channels and platforms. Now, the terms channels and platforms are kind of squishy, the definitions. Like people use them interchangeably all the time, including me. But I'm going to give a shot here at a more formal definition. Just know it's not super strict. Okay. A channel is something like the radio, uh, the TV, the internet, books, right? It's this big picture medium that we convey information through. A platform is specific, again, this nested systems idea, specific, um, it's a little confusing, uh, channels within the channel, right? A platform is things like a specific radio station or a specific television station, or in the internet, world, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Zoom. Those are all different platforms operating through the channel of the internet or the web, right? Lastly, layered on top of all of that are the tools we use to access those our channel and platform preferences. The obvious ones are things like the radio, like the actual radio with knobs and all that, or the television set, or the actual book you pick up, or your laptop, or your mobile phone, or your tablet. But some of the other ones that you might consider are things like your bicycle, or a good pair of running shoes, or things that get you into different environments where you communicate with people or those environmental elements. Okay, so those channels and platforms are one component to our communication system. The other component to that is the frequency and the value we put on any one of those base communication units, right? So the number of exposures, like used to be before COVID, we would have probably met 3 times a week in a classroom to have exposure to real-time conversation. Okay, now we meet a couple times a semester on Zoom. We interact through the Google Documents and comments and feedbacks, through Google Classroom, and then these videos, and then those occasional meetings that we set up, like we're doing this week. Okay, so the number of exposures are important, and then how often they occur. So that's like the difference between 3 class meetings all semester, for a total of whatever, 30, right? And they happen over 16 weeks versus those 30 meetings all in 1 week, right? There's the differences between how often those things occur has real impacts on what those communication events mean internally to us. And then how long each individual contact is each one an hour, a minute, right? And then all of that, along with what old Mark Zuckerberg over here has to say about trusted friends, it influences how much value we put on any one communicative unit or exchange, okay? And so a typical rule of thumb is high frequency, low value exchanges, like constantly seeing tweets, have the same impact on our worldview, how we understand the world, as low frequency, high value contacts, exchanges, right? So when we look at and critique our own communication systems, uh, we want to assess the impact each exchange has on our worldview, and kind of using this principle of high frequency, low value is equal to low frequency, high value. High frequency, low value is not equal to high frequency, high value, right? Okay. All right. Oh, just a quick definition. Also, this class is called interpersonal communication, but the idea of interpersonal and broadcast communication is a spectrum between one-on-one, really fast completion of base units, and not one-on-one, large audiences and slower completions of units. So if we were sitting down in the coffee shop talking, it would be very interpersonal. We would be completing our base units really quickly and involving a lot of the different senses in that interaction. This is more broadcast. I'm sending it out. It's going to take a while for me to get your feedback, and not going to have a lot of one-on-one back and forth. Okay, so that's kind of the spectrum of interpersonal broadcast. Finally, we put this all together to think about how our personal system works, what channels we use, what platforms we use, how often we use them, how much value we put into on the information we get from them, and then lastly, in my opinion, the actual content that we exchange through them. And we put that all together under these kind of idea of how do we collect information, how do we reflect on that, and then how we share it. And that process of collecting, reflecting, and sharing information is how we turn the external information gathering into internal knowledge. And that transition from external information gathering to internal knowledge is, in fact, what communication is. So this week, the activity is going to ask you to do that. It's on Google